Thank you very much, Naomi, for the kind invitation to you and the other student organizers, including Decolonised KCL, and also for the introduction. I wrote some reflections so that I will be able to stick to the time allotted for this initial intervention, and then I'll be happy to engage in discussion and questions. I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, where I work with others who stand in solidarity with Native American and indigenous peoples leading the movement for resurgence, decolonization, and reclamation of their homelands. This unceded territory where I am is now goes with the name of New Jersey. These lands were stolen to create settler colonial states, and those who were dispossessed continue to live under conditions of siege, surveillance, and extractivist violence. I work with groups that support land back, an imperative addressed to all settlers and settlers institutions, including the academic institution where I work. At its foundation, the city where I live and the city where I work were established on stolen indigenous land and shaped and cultivated by enslaved African peoples. I work with others who support the undying fight for Black liberation and its many manifestations here and across the planet. They include the Third World Liberation Front in the US, Atitude Quilombola in Brazil, the Black House Collective in South Africa, the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción in Puerto Rico, Decolonized Displaced in New York City, and the formation called the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperialist Feelings, which is now involved in a strike of the Modern Museum of Art, MoMA, in New York City. In fact, I took much of this multi-layer land acknowledgement with which I have begun from the main document of the Strike MoMA initiative campaign entitled Framework and Terms for Struggle. Perhaps in the discussion, we could talk about the importance of linking the struggles for decolonizing the university, decolonizing philosophy, and decolonizing, some would say, abolishing the museum as part of movements against the coloniality of the nation state. In line with initial lines of the framework document that I mentioned earlier, it is also important that I state that alongside indigenous genocide and expulsion, as well as racialized and enslaved labor, subsequent layers of the cities where I live and work have been built by generations of migrants and refugees from other zones of the world, violently impacted by colonial capitalist modernity. I keep drawing from this framework document that you should all read and visit. I happen to come from one of these places. I did not come to the United States as migrant or as refugee to the settler colony made nation state, the United States. I came as and remain a colonial subject with a second or third class citizenship status from an existing colonial territory in the Caribbean, the unincorporated island archipelago of Puerto Rico, a contemporary colony of the United States. It was in this colonial territory that I was first introduced to philosophy as an activity and to philosophy as an academic discipline. We should not confuse one with the other. While philosophy as an activity, as an attitude even, and maybe let's say with lower letter P, could be characterized as a rigorous formulation and exploration of fundamental questions. The discipline of philosophy with capital letter P tends to confuse rigor with disciplining, and a particular form of disciplining at that, one that only allows a limited set of questions and voices that predominantly come from a small part of the world to be counted as philosophical. Indeed, the very idea of decolonizing philosophy could be conceived as the reintroduction of philosophy with lower letter P into philosophy with capital letter P. The decolonization of philosophy, the academic discipline, by philosophy, the radical activity and attitude. This is not to mean that we should delimit the decolonization of philosophy to decolonizing the discipline of philosophy. When limited in such a way, the so-called decolonization easily remains within a limited and problematic framework that reproduces, rather than challenge, coloniality. So how should one then approach the project of decolonizing philosophy? I'd like to submit two ideas. First, that decolonizing philosophy should be less about decolonizing the discipline of philosophy, capital RP, an activity that still leaves the academic discipline at the center and therefore always remains oriented and limited by it, and more about the rigorous pursuit of the fundamental questions that emerge in the historical and still unfinished struggle for decolonization. I would also like to submit a second idea, namely that the struggle for decolonization is an intergenerational and collective project, as well as one that bridges spaces and temporalities in the process of creating an other world. Let me take a few minutes to explore these two proposals. First, a decolonizing philosophy should be less about decolonizing the discipline of philosophy and more about the rigorous pursuit of the fundamental questions that emerge in the historical and still unfinished struggle for decolonization. This idea could be put in a different way, that decolonizing philosophy is less about decolonizing a particular academic field than about generating a philosophy that is itself decolonizing, or a philosophy that is decolonial. Without generating a decolonial philosophy, any effort to decolonize philosophy, the discipline, is bound to remain caught in the coloniality of modern Western scholarly research and scholarly production. Decolonial philosophy, or maybe even better put, decolonial philosophical thinking, to highlight the activity and the verb, does not abandon, but rather reclaims the material taught by philosophy, the discipline, to assess it and in the process critically revise it, reject it when it needs to be rejected, and transform it when possible. Too much has been left out of the corpus of academic philosophy for decolonial philosophizing to be restricted to it or oriented by it, though. Decolonial philosophical thinking is not anchored in a discipline, but rather in a movement or movements, the movement of and for decolonization. From the perspective of decolonial philosophical thinking, movements for decolonization are not simply social manifestations of various forms of resistance against the catastrophe of modernity coloniality, which includes the presence and afterlives of indigenous genocide, conquest, colonization, and racial slavery in the contemporary world. Rather, decolonial movements, look at philosophically, are movements that seek to restore the conditions of possibility for love and understanding in the world. Likewise, philosophy, look at decolonially, cannot possibly seek to affirm simply the love of wisdom without committing itself to counter the catastrophe that makes love and wisdom an exception to a colonial rule in the world. Decolonial philosophical thinking can therefore be understood as a counter-catastrophic practice that seeks to restore the ample conditions of possibility for love and wisdom to flourish in the world. Now let me take some comments about the second point. The second point is that the struggle for decolonization is an intergenerational and collective project, as well as one that bridges spaces and temporalities in the process of creating an other world. If love and understanding are eminently intersubjective practices, this should mean that philosophy is too. If so, this would indicate that decolonial philosophical thinking has a point of departure in the struggles for love and for understanding that emerged in the midst of the catastrophe of modernity coloniality. This view has various consequences. For example, it means that decolonizing the curriculum of philosophy, the discipline, cannot be done without decolonizing the multiple other areas in the academy that can potentially offer insight into these struggles for love and understanding in an anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and colonial world. The classroom also has to be decolonized. It should no longer be in the service of the occupation of land and the erasure of questions that emerge from the ground of the colonial struggles, but be open to contact and engagement with the colonial struggles inside, but perhaps more importantly, outside the academy. If the colonial philosophical thinking is to be nurtured in academic settings, it has to include an effort not only to critically revise and expand the reading materials, but also to decolonize the classroom and the very conception of education and research. The decolonial classroom cannot end in the physical walls of a room or the library, as important as this could be. The decolonial classroom extends to the streets and to the spaces led by community and activist organizations that also counter catastrophe by making love and understanding an increasing possibility for those who Fanon called the condemned of the earth. The colonial philosophical thinking cannot emerge without this form of learning, as many crucial lessons for decolonial thinking are much better formulated by community and activist organizations than by academics. In fact, the symbolic value of academic work often depends on an advances a schism with other forms of knowledge production, just as it reproduces the ethos of modern colonial scholarly work. Instead of starting with the discipline or taking the academy as the point of departure, we should start from who we are and where we are, not merely as individuals, but as part of networks of oppression and emancipation, and not so much to assert our individual importance in the world or the uniqueness of our individual or regional perspective, but first and foremost, in the words of the framework and terms for the struggle document that I cited before, to acknowledge the debts that we owe each other. Acknowledgements of debts owed, to continue citing the document, from top to bottom and horizontally too, between and within groups, communities, and movements is a quintessential task in the effort to restore and expand love, understanding, and intersubjective reason in the world. And so let me come back to the start and repeat again, I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Lenape. With Fanon, I would say that I am not the bearer of absolute truths, but I think that it is time some things were said. By participating with others in the colonial struggles and by learning from our ancestors' ways of thinking and acting and being, I hope that I become worthy of saying some of these things and be heard. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. It was really insightful. Gargi, over to you.
I was very anxious about this, so I'm going to share some terrible PowerPoints because that makes me less anxious. I'm also going to start by saying, as I'm sure everyone is thinking, that in the hours after Al-Aqsa Mosque is raided, people stun grenaded and shot while at prayer during Ramadan, it kind of always feels hard to have a conversation at all, isn't it? We talk about these things, and I know that's only one instance of violence, but it's such a staged and theatricalized instance of violence. And I foolishly listened to some BBC News before I came. And of course, the double side of that theatricalized violence is we see the spectacle, and then we also hear the willful erasure immediately in the media. You kind of feel like that I'm not in a state of mind to speak comfortably with people, but I think speaking with people is always good, isn't it? So anyway, so I've got some slides to hide behind because at least then I can hide. And I thought that was so beautiful what you said, Nelson, so thank you so much for allowing me to be in the room with you. Oh, I see, now I can't see what I've got to say. All this stuff you know already, it's just so that I don't have to look at myself on the screen, that I have some other pictures to show, and I'm not doing a proper slideshow because then it sticks on Zoom. If you've had any contact with higher education pretty much anywhere in the world in recent decades, you probably know already that the university is quite an unlikely location for the decolonisation of anything. That's kind of not how universities work. That's not how they're formed. It's kind of not what their practice is. You know, had a few little pictures. Quick one from Britain about as Britain rushes out of the European Union, because of course we hate those foreigners, as we hate all other foreigners, one of the things that happened was access to European research money quite quickly dried up. As part of that process, although British universities have always been embedded in the militarized state, they become much more research indebted to the arms industry, because that's where cash is. So those kinds of things happen, but just kind of need to knock my own cynicism on the head as well, because actually, and this is interesting, I guess, for people who are not based in Britain, which I think quite a lot of people in the room are not, that we're also in a moment when the British state has started to bang on about decolonisation. We have even for British standards, a particularly strange Minister for Higher Education, who said in a speech only a few weeks ago that the decolonisation of history is kind of censorship that's akin to a Soviet Union style teaching of history. So there's an attack going on. And I think the thing, come on, let me do it. No, not my, oh yes. So although I think universities are unlikely terrain for, I've not muted myself, have I? For finding love, I guess, as Nelson said, for finding places of salvation and solace and progress, somehow the right in the place where I live, and I think this has an echo across the world, has reframed this era of a kind of renewed, ramped up, slightly remade, but continuation of state violence as a battle of ideas. Suddenly the right, certainly in Britain, is learning those ideas from more progressive elements and spitting them back at us. I never thought I'd hear a British parliamentarian say anything about the decolonial project, and yet suddenly the decolonial project appears as one of the kind of bogeymen, the kind of scare figures of UK politics, alongside some others. People in the room who are based in Britain will know, alongside a very active demonisation of Black Lives Matter, a very active demonisation of school climate strikers. Those things are all kind of sewn together. So I think you can't give up on the university, because there's something, you know, the other side is saying, we think that stuff matters. You look like you're just talking about the curriculum, but we're kind of scared of you, or at least we're irritated by you. We want our culture war to be hung on your interests. They wouldn't learn our songs and our language if that wasn't the case. But what I think is a little bit challenging for how we might then approach that battle of ideas, this might just be me, but I really kind of started to feel that what the main challenge is how very little the university ever teaches any of us. It's not only so partial, but it's kind of so idiosyncratic what a university education teaches you. Kind of in Britain certainly verges on the eccentric, like we were talking just before the lights went up about the move to hyper-specialisation very quickly. So you'll know one thing very narrowly. You'll know it in the very particular idiosyncratic way that your teachers say, because they will mark your work. Knowing it in that way for your institution is part of the kind of way that you become branded, but it can also act as a way to make it harder to speak to others. And I know that all of that kind of display of very specialist knowledge, so specialist that there are very few other people who you can speak to easily, is a throwback to an earlier model of cultural capital. But somewhere between instrumentalism and snobbery, there must still be some kind of sweet spot of learning that enriches the collective. It's whether there's anything in the university that can give us that stuff. So I have to keep moving the people around because I can't see my own words. So then I started to think, because I'd been asked to think about how I teach. And actually, I'm not teaching at the moment because I'm working on a project about how COVID has impacted on Black and brown communities in Britain. But normally I'm kind of intensive teacher, teach different things and have taught across disciplines. Because I'm not very, I think lots of people in Britain who work broadly on issues of race are not easily packaged into a discipline. So I'm one of those people. So, you know, you go where the work is, you kind of okay, you want me to be this today, I'll be that. So for a while I've been being a sociologist. That's not my former training, but it works. The stuff I know can work in a sociology context. And certainly with colleagues, we've talked of it as is the job to dismantle symbolic violence. If we're in the university, which tells so many, certainly less advantaged students, pretty much all racialized students in Britain, but you're not human yet, but stick with me and learn my ways and you might become human. How could we make that something different? So it doesn't feel like Pygmalion, that you're kind of getting yourself washed away as you learn to ventriloquize something else. And I think often, you know, on the bad days when I wonder what's the point, I think, oh yes, dismantling symbolic violence. So I still think there is something in that element of the project. And I think some of what Nelson was talking about is an element of that as well. Not that you're bringing relief, but you have to be able to see the beast that is dehumanizing you, the beast that is bringing the violence. There is an analytic set of tools that is still available, sometimes even from very mainstream education. The point is to make it useful for us, you know, so that's one bit of it. The bit I think is tricky alongside that, and if people have got things to say about this, I really am desperate to talk about it, is that in my experience as a teacher, revealing the horror of knowledge making, if you start to uncover what our intertwined global histories are, it seems to become hard to ever know again. Even the will to mastery of knowing, that there's no way outside of mastery to think about knowing. And the knowledge is so heavy. The knowledge of the past is so heavy that it kind of freezes you in terms of inquiry today. I hope that makes sense. And it's a thing that kind of, and I'll tell you something else that my students say to me in a few minutes that will, I hope, explain that a bit more. Yeah, so it's already here in this bit. Because another thing, and students were saying this to me 30 years ago when I started teaching, and I keep trying different things, and I think sometimes I get away around it, but then I don't really. Is this kind of impasse of what happens when you share with people something of the true horror of how the human-shaped globe has been made. If you really start to say anything about what we as humanity have been to each other, how the global economy comes about, what people must do to survive because of what is done to them, what the violence of dispossession and expropriation really means, not as words, but as physical experiences. That's quite a burden. And I haven't found a way around this, but I have had students say to me quite rightly, how can you hold and move forward with that pain? Because if you didn't know it before and you're open to knowing it, if you really hear it, that's shattering, isn't it? And I also think perhaps if you're not shattered, maybe you didn't quite hear what we were saying to each other. I think the point that I've not managed to get beyond is how you go through that learning process, which I think I don't know a way of avoiding, because that is the thing we must know together, and not feel more impotent, because the weight is so kind of, you know, centuries of violence. And that's, you know, they're the two bits of the question that I have. But the kind of learning we must do together and do together in little places, even in this kind of neoliberal university space. Can feel like a burden that doesn't take us to the next step. You know, no point learning things unless we change the world. So then slightly more, if not upbeat, at least other kinds of questions. So things that I think are worth toying with, despite my not being able to resolve this issue of how, once you have learnt about the true horror of the world, how you move on from that moment of horror, that, you know, being transfixed by what the extent of the horror is is what learning might be like. And actually some of them, I think, echo what Nelson said, but in a different, I have a different kind of training, different way of speaking. I've already said one, against specialism. The university as it is, pretty much everywhere, is seemingly almost totally dedicated to upholding and propagating knowledge for death, demarcating who can and should live, reconstructing constantly the terms of the human in ways that expel too many. Might not do that absolutely directly, but actually sometimes now it does do it absolutely directly. Many of the things we're learning across disciplinary spaces are kind of both technique and legitimation for how to say you are not worthy. And it's not only you're not worthy of respect, you're not worthy of life. So there's this whole, the global machinery of knowledge is doing this kind of thing. In passing, I don't think our job is to persuade a reluctant audience of our humanness, just because I think that can be a trap, can't it? If you learn something about how the dominant think and how they think of you, there's a kind of seductive will to learn the language to say, no, no, we are human, we are human. I think maybe that's not the task. Instead, better to try and relearn something about the pleasures and possibilities of learning despite the university. And I think this is something like what Nelson was saying about what are the key questions, or what you're calling philosophy with a small p. That even though the university will hide from you what a lived knowledge that can connect us to each other will be, even if it knows it, it will do its best to kind of commodify, fragment, and mythologize it in ways that you can't see it anymore. It can't do it completely. And there's something about us being together can remake some of that. And some of that might be about mixing up the questions and the disciplinary questions, so that I was playing in my head before when I thought I could tell more jokes, and there isn't time to tell jokes, that the splitting of philosophy, economics and law was a way of different ways of thinking of what the human subject is, and that bringing those back together with science and technology. I was going to say sex, money and violence, but I'm not going, can't tell, but I was going to make a slide, but I didn't make that. But it's about bringing those aspects together differently, because we're being invited to see the world in these specialist fragments for the interests of a market that doesn't see us. Whereas our job is to kind of mix up the pieces and speak to each other differently, do the different bits. I forgot to say earlier, actually, that book, Empire's Endgame, it's not really my book. That's a family book. That's a book written with 7 of my adopted nieces, nephews, children, absolutely collectively, every page. You can't, our objective was that you wouldn't, none of us even at the end would know who had written which line on each page. And it's really like that because of how we wrote it. Some of that was about 8 people who come from very different kinds of academic training, trying not to shout each other down, but instead to kind of pull in an elastic way what we could know with each other. So I might know something, but then one of my co-authors would know a bit more from a different perspective and stretch it a bit so that the knowledge is, it looks different. I hope it looks different. Because surely the point is to build a knowledge for our shared survival. It's a question about whether the university is a suitable vehicle for that project, but knowing must be part of what our shared survival will look like. Because none of us are going to make it alone, are we? Then I had another couple of things to say just about Britain. This is if you're not from Britain, just to, I don't know how much this is happening in other places. Britain is in a strange moment in terms of its place in the world, its public rhetoric, in terms of the place of public institutions such as universities. And as part of that kind of contradictory moment we're in, which I do think is part of Empire's long end game, at last, the absolute breakup of Empire, which is almost certainly going to be the breakup of the United Kingdom. Britain will have to be something else. Within that moment, strangely, even the language of decolonisation has been taken up by the neoliberal university in very contradictory ways. partly to recognise the ways in which student movements force the university to do something else, partly in a kind of mixed bag thing, so it's a word that means everything to all people. But it's also, I think, a sign of, however bad faith the employer's take-up of that term might be, there's something in that language that really speaks to students and potential students. You know, it is, marketing is a recognition of your market. It might be a bad faith recognition, or it might be a confused, contradictory recognition, but it's a recognition that something has to be said to the young. I think, oh, that's kind of interesting. What is it that speaks so much intergenerationally around this idea of decoloniality in Britain right now? Because I wouldn't have guessed that 20 years ago. If you'd have said to me 20 years ago, let's see, 20 years ago it's still in the aftermath of the Lawrence Inquiry. Again, for people who are younger or not from Britain, the Lawrence Inquiry is a public inquiry in this country in the aftermath of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, a young black man killed in South London in a racist attack, and then the police just harangued the family and never investigated. It was part of the many, many other family campaigns at that time around racist attacks that were not investigated, but somehow that becomes the end point. And then there's a kind of thing of like, oh yes, Britain deals with racism. We have institutional racism, we'll investigate it. That led to 20 years of bureaucratic practice in which we look internally in terms of organisations about monitoring, counting. It's been a huge shift for the student movement to go from that kind of institutionally focused anti-racism, a kind of bureaucratic anti-racism. And I'm absolutely built in that generation. You know, I spent 15 years of my life arguing for everyone to monitor everything, to suddenly see a student movement which says that bureaucratic practice is nowhere near what justice in education would be, that global justice can't be counted in that way, that we cannot reckon with history without taking on these other things. So the two things I thought there might be. I wonder if the interest from people at different points in their lives and educational journeys, in Britain, I can only speak about Britain really, is a kind of expression of longing for another kind of education, an education that does something quite different from the tabulation, hierarchies and career readiness of the current university, even as the current university sells the decolonial lens to students that it will then say, I will make you career ready. And it might sound silly, but I really take pleasure in the idea that we're longing for a learning that we can't quite configure yet, that there's something about our longing to be together that says, I long for something that I cannot yet say, but I know I long for it with you. And that together we're reaching beyond the strictures of those institutionalized spaces of learning. Again, perhaps that's philosophy small p. Because despite ourselves, despite all the horror and boredom and drudgery and partiality of formal education, we can't help but believe in what education could be. And so what I'd hope, well, I don't know, I feel like I always say this, but I'm going to try and say it slightly differently. What I think is a good way to think about education, and if I was to summarize my own attitude to teaching anything, is about taking myself, ourselves, both more and less seriously. Now, the first one's kind of easy because we're trained through education to take ourselves very, very seriously. I'm being so serious now. But of course, what I'm trying to say is not be very pompous and po-faced, but to remind ourselves, despite the ways in which things are marketized and commodified and stolen from us, our learning together really, really matters. That's a matter of life and death, our ability to learn the thing that needs to be learned together. The second, to take ourselves less seriously, I think that is trickier. But you know, I spent ages trying to write these last 3 sentences to try and explain what I meant. So I hope it makes sense. One, I think, is to kind of forget yourselves. You open yourself to the exhilarating newness of not knowing, something the university very rarely allows you to feel. but I think is close again to what philosophy small p might be. To abandon education as a consolidation of self. Formal education acts like you are lacking and imperfect and vulnerable, and I will pour knowledge and authority into you until you are invulnerable, that you become a kind of enclosed, self-contained entity. We must be against the ridiculous claim of knowledge as mastery, because everything in our shared histories and interconnected histories shows it. So, as you can imagine, this slide just started up with to laugh, and then the images wrote across my screen. And I said to laugh, yes, to cry, but also to laugh, because I think the ability to laugh together about what we do not yet know is part of an opening. I seem to have spoken for much too long. Sorry.
That was great. Thank you so much. So us who organised the event will now ask some questions. I think it has been an amazing discussion so far. Maybe Mercedes can ask the first question.
Sure. Hi everyone. Thank you, Nelson and Gargi. That was super interesting. So one of the questions we thought of, which I suppose both of you have sort of touched on, is what are the limits of decolonising, for example, philosophy within universities? And like sort of, for example, what like, is there a need for connections in other disciplines, which I think we have talked about, but also maybe outside of academia? Should we be looking beyond the university to be able to do this? I don't know, whoever has something to say first, let us know.
I think Nelson should go first, really, because his whole talk was about this question. I can say things, but his things.
Well, I think it would be important for contemporary student movements that are seeking to decolonize education, to open paths for decolonization within the university, as difficult as that can be, to also learn from previous generation of students who have organized for similar purposes. Because I think there are things to learn from those struggles, from the challenges, problems, limits, right? And then the ongoing, what happened after those movements took place too, right? The aftermath, and the result of what they achieved and what happened with their achievements and where that is today, right? There is a lot to learn there. And so, but part of that points to another major issue that is something left aside in these conversations about decolonizing the university. When you look at the work of those other movements, and you have an opportunity to talk with student veterans from previous strikes, for example, many of them will tell you how crucial was it for them to have free time to be able to meet, to organize, to talk to each other, and to learn together. And so the question that, education then in those different times, during the late 60s, 70s, fees for education in many of these places were not as high as now, because, the wave of neoliberalism has involved privatization of resources and also increase in fees and tuition and all of that, making many of the students who do not have the capital to be able to finance all of that, to save their free time, to invest their free time working and getting debt. So you're working and getting debt so that when you go out of the university, now you have to work more to pay the debt. And so by the time that you have some more free time to be able to organize, to do anything, you already have a family, you're a mother, you're a parent, you're this, you're that, you're working, you have more debt and so on, and you're disqualified. So before, the university was a kind of a web for this ingenious thinking and organizing And part of that was because of the university then, the conditions, the economic conditions allow for that kind of activity. So I think that part of the struggle for decolonizing the university today, it has to involve the claim for, lowering fees. I mean, you saw this clearly in Rose Must Fall. Rose Must Fall is in South Africa, started Rose Must Fall and turned into Fees Must Fall. See the connection between fees must fall, and then, but also the statute comes, but the fees have to come down, right? And then this process has to be linked with what? With the land back movement too, because we're part of the university is also in a land that was stolen, taken in a colonial, in a settled colony, which is South Africa. So it connects even from outside the university. You are in dialogue with Rose Must Fall, you stated, and so these are lessons also that one takes from other dimensions of that movement, but also a previous movement. Thinking about the Third World Liberation Front, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the birth of ethnic studies and Black studies and Africana studies in the US. So there is a lot to learn there. Now, in philosophy, I think that within philosophy, we can call our instructors, our department, we should demand that our instructors and that the department and the university hire instructors who are competent in teaching not only about canonical authors, but also about counter-canonical authors and not Western authors, but then also to make connections between those debates and ongoing efforts for decolonization in different parts, including these student movements, right? And to make the connection and how to see how philosophy emerges in these multiple spaces. And so the classroom can become a space for connection. And through that, then also the classroom could become a space for students organizing, linking up with local organizations and supporting other movements for struggle. And I think that is doable. And there are things that can be done within the university that can empower other generations, ourselves and other generations, to continue the struggle with more clarity and with more possibilities.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Gargi, if you want to add anything, or if we'd like to move to the next question.
Okay, I mean, I'll try and resist the urge to just answer everything twice, but I also, again, I'm just talking about Britain because I live in Britain, and Britain is going through some extreme crises. But again, almost despite the university, issues that are coming through the student movement, and I absolutely hear what Nelson is saying, and certainly in the academic trade union, we've talked about it often, that as students increasingly work pretty much full time as they study, student activism becomes a different thing. And it also, you can see nationally, becomes differently spread geographically. So the more elite universities are more present in the student movement. They're not radical, and I've made some excellent comrades through that, but we're all aware that the university where I teach, everybody works, many people are carers and work, that they're not going to run to be they haven't got time to fight the National Union of Students, that those spaces are not really available to them. So something about, oh well, then what is the centre of gravity of student activism? But because the model of higher education funding in this country has become so unsustainable, and COVID has made it intensely visible that that's the case. Again, for people who don't live in Britain, that Britain's fees regime for universities has meant that universities became huge landlords, that the flow of money in through fees was not stable enough. You couldn't tell what money you'd have. So many of the universities that could thought, what do we know we'll get? We'll get rents off those students. So they basically became big landlords with a bit of learning attached. COVID has blown that out of the water because, of course, people couldn't come to the places they'd rented, didn't have the money to pay the rent. The current wave of student activism in this country is around rent strike, which is very closely linked then to other kinds of struggles that are happening in this country around rental accommodation and furlough. So a convergence happening despite the kind of attempted elitism of the university. And I think there's maybe something around working precarity, again, in precarious work. Many, if not the majority of people students in higher education in Britain also are precarious workers. So there's increasingly a kind of interflow between the kinds of independent trade unions who organise in the precarious labour market around issues around rent strike and renters' rights, and then just issues around what being poor in urban places are. And I think all of that then flows across issues around race, and things about race in Britain are so odd. But another enraging thing that came across my phone this morning is Angela Rayner, who's no favourite of mine, but even I think it's a bit rude of Keir Starmer to say it's her fault that the Labour Party did rubbish in the local elections last week, was deputy leader of the Labour Party, gave some terrible speech today or yesterday where she said, oh, all these people are not voting Labour because of their issue with immigration. We're going to have to deal with that. No, then people look in all the polls, none of the seats they lost did it say, oh, look, people are saying that's immigration. But that kind of dog whistle race politics is still the kind of default in Britain. And I can't tell anymore whether it really works in some parts of the country. Also, Britain has very different geography, and part of the kind of resentment towards London is that London does suck in the resources of the country, even though many Londoners are very poor and it has very, very high rates of child poverty. But it's also clearly a diverse global city. Not all of Britain looks like that, and so the story around race is odd. But things like Black Lives Matter make it a bit different, because suddenly these absolutely white places, you're seeing very, very young people running their own protests. Hardly see a black person at their protests because they live in places like St Ives or somewhere where there isn't really a local black population. But there's something going on with that. There's something going on with discourse around gender, sexual identity, and a kind of generational shift. And I think precarious work and precarious housing also builds an alliance. I always think there's something going on. I think there's something different going on now. There's some kind of people are edging towards each other, and absolutely work around decolonisation in the university. What's the point? Yeah, I'd like to read some more interesting books. Who wouldn't? But that can't be the horizon of our ambition. The horizon of our ambition is to say, learning is part of building a better world. Where are the places that I can, and who are the people I can learn with, and that's has to span across the campus. I will try and be shorter next.
Thank you, both of you. A very related question is, what does decolonising then mean to you? I mean, we've all established that it obviously means a lot more than just being situated in the university, and has huge effects outside of it. So yeah, what does decolonisation mean to you in the context of just all these more conversations about it that sometimes have a very limited scope, I think? Again, whoever wants to answer at first can speak.
I couldn't hear that very well. Can you just summarise the end bit of the question? Sorry, my sound's going in and out. It's my fault. So.
Oh, that's fine. My internet's not great either. But what does decolonisation mean to you, basically?
Still, it's not clear. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So what does decolonisation mean to you?
Okay, I'm going to start and say again what I think the question is, in case Nelson can hear me better than he can hear you, Lauren. I'm sorry, I think we're all having some sound issues. So I understood the question to, this nub of the question to be, what does decolonisation mean to each of us? Yes, and I know there was a preamble which I didn't get all of, but you can pull us back into the preamble beforehand or afterwards. And I think Decolonisation to me, in terms of in a university setting, is a way of using the tools of education to come to terms with the violence on which education is built, to reuse the analytic and historical and documentary resources of especially the Western University, but I wonder if there's anything but the Western University, even if they're not all in the West, to revisit what learning can and cannot be, and to use that also to kind of shake up what the institutionalization of learning is. So to kind of retrieve learning from its form as a ticket, a tool, a credential, a narrowing of the gangway so fewer and fewer people go through, a stick to wield against other people, and instead somehow to say that in all of this stuff that's been stolen from all of the peoples of the world from all eternity in uneven ways, there is still something about how our ability to, as humans, to see each other and learn about each other and of each other and from the past and imagine a future, even despite the trappings of the university, could still, some bits of it could be retrieved. And I think everyone has said, not retrieved only within the university, but to say there's some kernel of something like, well, I like Nelson's formulation of philosophy for small p, that humanness and the possibility of human freedom and fullness and I've forgotten the word, but you know, that when you get what you want, when we all get what we deserve, not in a threatening way, but it's the promise of what being alive is, that our ability to learn collectively is part of that. But for that to happen, as I was kind of saying, there's this weight of horror to just kind of encounter, isn't there? And that I don't know how you could move from encountering the weight of horror to the bit that I know is out there somewhere.
One answer to the question that comes from the writings of Caribbean authors like Mbembe and Frantz Fanon is that decolonization is the end of the world. It's the end of the world as we know it. You can also be taken from Fanon. You can also see that as a process of restoration of things to their proper places, to places where we can find each other, where we can seek to relate to each other openly, where we can build bridges across our differences and grow and enrich very much a world unlike the terms of the hegemonic terms of our world right now. It is important to know that decolonization, at least when you read the authors who write about the activists, the shakers and movers who invested much of their lives, if not their very lives, to this effort, have characterized decolonization not only as a process of undoing, but also as a process of redoing, as a creative process. And it's one that doesn't have any prescribed, future kind of a layout, detailed layout of the future. But the future is born in the very process of coming together to counter the forces of coloniality now. And in that very process of struggle, we find each other, we communicate with each other. Right? As the framework document states, we acknowledge the debts that we have to each other and we work with them and through them. And in that very process, we build different forms of relating to ourselves, relating to our surroundings, related to knowledge, to culture, to all kind of practices. And this other world that we want is born in that very process and anticipated. So we live in a world with multiple anticipations of that other world that we want, but one that can never be fully completed, that is always in process as in the making. Those are some items that I would highlight about decolonization.
Thank you. Great answers there. I have a bunch of questions, but maybe I'll start with, there seems to be a power asymmetry in the Academy for Philosophy in particular, but also for other disciplines, where it's seen as knowledge being produced in the global north or the imperial centers, and then disseminated to the global south. How can we like intervene on that type of relationship and acknowledge that knowledge is produced elsewhere and is legitimate as well? Maybe specifically for philosophy, if Nelson, you can address that, but also for other disciplines as well.
Well, you know, I think that right now we have an example of this very activity, in the sense that we're now being convened by students that are linked or supporting a movement for decolonizing philosophy, decolonizing the places where they are right now, and they are actually being motivated and inspired by efforts that have taken place in places in the global south, particularly in South Africa. So clearly our debate and the horizon here, the space for thinking comes directly from the south in that way. And that's a project that, you know, it's not only about this conversation, it's about what the implications for curricula, implications for other areas of university education. Now, this is actually, I rather highlight and celebrate this kind of juncture led by students and committed students. I think that this could be linked with, but it's even more important than, efforts that you see in philosophy departments to integrate a more multicultural, you know, multiculturalizing the canon and other perspectives that, as you know, typically they end up simply including other authors and ideas, but within the framework of Western academic philosophy, where still with a very traditional and discipline-based conception of scholarship and of generating questions. And at the end, what you have, for the most part, is a reiteration of the centrality of the same figures anyway, or of the same kind of a style of engaging debates. For example, I can tell you just briefly one anecdote. I participated once in a critical theory seminar with a number of distinguished critical theories at my previous institution, UC Berkeley. And we had a long semester to discuss issues about, you know, what is critical theory and this and that. And I remember that most of the members there were very strongly Eurocentric, right? Critique is about, is rooted in alignment, and then it has this manifestation in 19th century German philosophy and 19th and 20th century French and German philosophy. That's it. There was a recognition that other places did critique too, but only to the extent that they read those thinkers, they learned what critique was. And I remember that one day, you know, so that was as much as the multicultural effort. Like, yes, we can include as electives, right? As electives, our students can take these courses about these non-Western authors and about these non-canonical matters, because ultimately, yes, the West has been very generous and has given itself to the rest of the world, and, you know, even critically, that was the approach. And I remember once that I cited Fanon, one side in The Wretched of the Earth, I believe Fanon says that something along the lines that the North African did not have to wait for the French to know what critique was. And I remember that all the generous welcoming of different perspectives stopped there. I realized that the additions to philosophy, other voices could be admitted, but only if it was taken for granted that theory was born in Europe, and if anything, it was a gift from that place to the world. Only if you bought into the idea that you're an addendum to that, then you're welcome. Other than that, you're not. Right? So that's why I'm saying that you are already starting in a different point of departure. And so I think that this is part of the solution. The question is how to connect it with other movements, and how to, as Naomi very insightfully pointed out at the beginning, how to navigate the different risks. And as she put it, how to navigate between the practicality and the radicality, right? That you need to be attentive to both. And unfortunately, not too many, or even academic leaders and even scholars that we would consider supporters, I think are keenly aware of this dynamic as what I heard Naomi say at the beginning. That's why my endorsement and faith comes with what you're doing here.
Can I ask a bit more about this? Maybe not, maybe even for the organizers. I know it's a bit scary for you to talk, but I wonder if part of what Nelson's just identified, and I'd wondered about it as, you know, very much not a philosopher, whether for philosophy, the suggestion that there are other modes of knowing the world and other modes of argumentation goes beyond, you know, history, literature. You say, oh, well, other people are writing these things, but it's still history or literature. But it's to say that philosophy itself is something different, as if the core idea of what the practice of philosophy is cannot hold if you say, oh, there is a criticality that emerges independently of Europe. Is that, I'm asking anyone in the room who knows more about philosophy than me, because I think you're right, there's something much more like, I'll show you the door now, what do you mean? Oh, you're off. Whereas in other disciplines, even though it's not been happy, there's been a kind of accommodation around, well, we will mishear you as if you're just talking about diversifying the curriculum. You say change the structures of the institution. I'll say, oh yes, I heard you to say buy a few more books for the library. But for philosophy, there's something different, isn't there? Because once you start to say these are not the founding concepts, it's like maybe all bets are off. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. If anyone could say more, that I'd really like to hear.
If I can just very quickly note that I think that there is I was tempted to include this in my talk, but I didn't, that there is philosophy as a discipline with capital P is kind of very ironic, because on the one hand, you know, you get into a philosophy classroom and you often hear that you cannot possibly define or pin down philosophy, what philosophy is. That is so open, that is so rich, that we have so many different accounts. Basically, every philosopher reinvents what philosophy is when they are doing it. That, you know, the most original among them. But then as soon as you follow that track and you say, okay, so we cannot say ultimately what it is, it's open, it's many things. But once you cross the border from the West to the non-West, then immediately the exceptions start. Well, not exactly that we meant, right? When you go to other directions, then all the prohibitions and the walls begin to start, right? And so it's very bifurcated. You on the one hand celebrate it as very open, but on the other hand, it's extremely disciplined. And it's partly disciplined because philosophy, because it has to do with reason. Reason is one of the core concepts of Western modernity. So if you let go of reason, it's like you're leaving one of the last bastions of the West. And so you still, obviously, I mean, neoliberalism and consumer culture can care less about reason and science, as we saw even with the Trump, right, the anti-science. But still within the academy, there is a respect for knowledge, and they are the guardians, right? Fanon called the guardians of the Greco-Roman pedestal, right? So they can play, they want to play both sides, but we need to go beyond.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think also with philosophy, there tends to be these layers of abstraction, which kind of remove from the emotional qualities of what we're talking about, which is kind of what you were saying, both of you mentioned in your presentations. And I think that's something that if we truly mean to decolonize philosophy, needs to be maybe more, we need to reorientate our knowledge more towards the emotional side rather than just the like reason or the strict truth falsity dichotomy. Yeah. Yeah, we can go to some questions from the audience now.
Can I say one more sentence for what you're all saying? That I also wonder if it's something, firstly, I mean, I think the division between emotion and reason, that's also part of the violence, isn't it? So like, you can think or you can feel, but you can't do both. We know who gets to do the feeling, who gets to do the thinking. We all know that story. But I also wonder if it's, even the concept of reason is so loaded here, because as if the only thing that you could say there are other ways of thinking critically is that's unreason. That the reason, despite, as you say, being this huge abstract word, has no elasticity in it, has no transferability. Reason means only what these steps. And yes, it's also, you know, individual and imaginative, but it only means these things. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because not all concept words have that kind of, like that. Anyway, other people want to talk.
Yeah, we'll go to some questions from the audience. I can't see them in front of me, but Mercedes, if you want to read them.
Yes, we have a question from the chat. What are the dangers of thinking we can arrive at a decolonised curriculum in the past tense, or as a presumed like finished product?
I think you already, right, when you asked the question about what we mean by decolonization, I think that we started to address this important question. And that's why also, you know, I referred before when I talked about one thing is decolonizing philosophy, and then shifting that from decolonizing philosophy with capital P to creating a decolonial philosophy, which I characterize as, you know, decolonial philosophical thinking. So the ing, the kind of verb ongoing form, is very important because it's part of an ongoing process. Once you put the ed, once you collapse it to the past, you have, it's very likely that you're already reproducing some criteria or terms from coloniality. So you always have to, you know, you can never kind of think that you are going to be able to develop this final, you know, curriculum that is already decolonized. If you do that, rather, that's the moment when you believe that, that's the moment when you start disciplining more strongly, and you are no longer decolonizing so much.
Gargi, do you have anything to add, or shall I move on to the next question? Angel Quintero, do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Nelson, for your very stimulating talk. And I would like to ask you a question. And it's, what is the relationship between what you were proposing to a tradition that came mostly from, not from philosophy, but from anthropology, but then later moved to most of the disciplines in Latin America. We started, I think, in Brasilia, which is what is called the dialogue of knowledge, diálogo de saberes, where you incorporate into university dialogue at the same standing of the professors, other types of knowledge that are not sustained by an academic career, but by other type of experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's great to see you in this forum. I think that you are right now in an authentic San Juan, Puerto Rican up condo, whereas mine is virtual. I wish that I was there close to you. Mine is virtual here.
By the ceiling, you can know that it's an old San Juan ceiling. Yeah. It's from Puerto Rico. Hello to everybody from Puerto Rico.
So yes, I mean, that's, yeah, in Latin America and different parts of the world, there are, you know, different proposals that have challenged the expertise, the predominance of academic, strictly supposed academic learning, and academic learning that usually takes as a model, of course, what is produced in certain universities in the North, in certain journals, in certain disciplines, right? And becomes a satellite of kind of these places, whether it's Chicago, Princeton, Harvard, whatever it is. And so there have been these traditions that kind of challenge that in different ways. the dialogue of knowledges, or diálogo de saberes, I have found some colleagues in Latin America that maybe take it something maybe close to what I'm saying, although those colleagues tend to explicitly refer to decoloniality and decolonization, and not only to dialogue. Dialogue in philosophy, actually, what exists in philosophy is being very central to philosophy, is the so-called East-West dialogue. That may be, you know, in philosophy from the 60s and so on, became a strong paradigm. I don't even anticipated, probably motivated by the decolonization movements in part, by the appearance of different parts of the world, but calling for a kind of a comparison between different knowledges that now you put at the same level with Western knowledge. But typically those dialogues ignore the power differentials between these different regions, right? So that the dialogue, you know, you cannot simply rehearse a dialogue now, saying, you know, especially when sometimes what we take as this other knowledge itself has been packaged and produced by the Western concepts in the first place, right? So you have to engage in a critique of the colonial relations and of coloniality in order to, as a propedeutic, to enter into any dialogue. And by then you realize that the actual dialogue is less about these knowledges that somehow must come to the table parallel, and the dialogue should be about the dialogue in the engagement of addressing the power relations themselves, right? That is and then it's no longer only a dialogue, it's a common struggle of comradeship. So it's a propedeutic of any kind of dialogic model, I would say, in an academic setting. Now, I'm not saying that the diálogo de saberes simply remains like that, but I think there is a risk. And in fact, I have talked with colleagues who have resisted the push to seriously considering the coloniality and struggles and valuing the voices of activists when engaging in the diálogo de saberes, because they take the diálogo de saberes as, well, let's go to a community in the Amazons with not a lot of, you know, let's say, relationship with the Brazilian nation state, and that's how we enact our dialogue. Or let's go to the community in the barrio in this, and let's see how they conceive a space, and that's important. But they are not thinking that that all of that is taking place, particularly in community, given, you know, within concepts of space, temporality, subjectivity that are already jeopardized by the colonial relations. And that if that is not, there is not a explicit struggle to engage, to be active in dealing with that, the community also could collapse into some problems. And then you are idealizing another knowledge, putting it with another even worse knowledge in the academy. And then this becomes another kind of a scenario for the scholars, right? To engage in community relations and so on. Whereas the actors in communities that are dealing with the very contradictions in their communities, right? Those voices are kind of left out. So what I'm calling is more for more attention with that, with organizers, with very mindful organizers who work with communities, but that are generating knowledge in dialogue with communities in plural and with other activists. So I think there may be some differences there. This would be a long dialogue, but I think that the concept itself, dialogue of knowledges, still sometimes collapses into a more sophisticated form of multiculturalism. And that's my fear. And but those that do it in another way, you know, have of course, no problem. And I think that we need to connect, make connections, and do not think that we're inventing out of the blue. You know, we need to connect with the past and present. And so the question is well taken.
Great. Thanks. I don't know if you have anything to add, Gargi? No. We'll go on to the next question. Sorry, someone had their hand up. It was, if we go to Haj.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Prof. I just want to ask, because you always, you often mention the big P in philosophy and also the small p. Again, thank you very much for your wonderful lectures, also for Professor Gargi. That's actually my very short and quick questions, because I want to know more about that, the difference between the big P and the small p, and also if that is applied also to sociology, the big S and the small s, something like that. Thank you very much, bro.
Thank you. I'll be brief because I've talked quite a bit. It's interesting, this notion of, whether the lowercase p and the other p, whether you can relate it to the other areas. That's an interesting discussion, because I immediately think in some way yes, in some ways not. But in some way yes. But we have to see, because of the birth of these, particularly the social sciences in the 19th century. So I wonder if the S would be something else. I mean, it's intriguing and interesting, but I let others talk about this. But I would like to reorient your question about the meaning of the lowercase p and the capital letter P. I would like to reroute it to the students who study philosophy who are here. How do you understand? Did that make sense? And if so, can you share a little bit about it for the sake, of helping to shed light on this differentiation, if it makes sense to you?
Yeah, I think that distinction definitely makes sense, especially looking at, like me being a philosophy student, there's a certain set of things I feel I am expected to know from the academy, like maybe that would be the capital P philosophy. But yeah, I think there is a truer philosophy almost coming from, I don't know, the definition of the word is just love of knowledge. And I think your distinction really did help clear that up.
Yeah, I find it quite funny how I find that I think philosophy is everything. Maybe it's because I study philosophy, but I think philosophy is just like, it seeps its way into everything. Many discussions are philosophical discussions. Every discussion is philosophical. I don't know. And so I feel like that's philosophy with a lower p. And then I came to uni and I realized that there's something essential that you have to learn that is philosophy, and these things aren't philosophy, and that you have to have learned these things. And I was like, wait, what? And so I found the distinction interesting, because I do find that that it, I don't know, I think it's ironic that philosophy is something really strict. I suppose it links to what you said, Gargi, about reason. It's somehow everything, but also something very specific and rigid. And yeah, I think that's sort of my perspective as a philosophy student.
If anyone else in the audience wants to say maybe who did philosophy, feel free as well. Now's your chance.
Could I ask?
Yeah, go for it.
How's it going? I'm John. I'm in Dublin, in Ireland. And the basic question I have is, how do you define colonialism today? Given like Ireland is a post-colonial state, which still has a lot of the baggage, 100 years after independence, okay, that what power does is holds lots of things and lots of cards post, your decolonialist process. So I'm just curious about that. I'm also curious about philosophy itself. As a second question, like myself and another guy who's probably, I'm more of a sociologist, he's more of a philosopher. We have been running philosophy outside of the academy for a couple of years here in Dublin, and where essentially it's a sort of non-academic based conversation using provocations from philosophy or philosophers, female, male, in that sense. So one of the things when I listen to the discussion is the kind of holding of the philosophy within the academy, and I think that it's really important that somehow there has to be a bridge between the two things, that there isn't this elite sphere for elite philosophers, that everybody can do philosophy and it should be open to anybody. And that it's exactly what it was when, you know, whenever it was born, wherever in the world, in the West and the East, it was a conversation between people about what mattered most to them. But unfortunately, we've academicized it. We give people degrees for it, and obviously it's good to read. I think that's important. But there is this issue about the democratizing of philosophy beyond the academy as well. And I'm just, so they're just two things. I could ask lots of questions, but I'm just curious about the current, like the definition of colonialism that you work from today, and this relationship between the academy and, let's call it, civil society anywhere in the world, and how they are going to relate to each other in the future, in terms of, like, obviously one of the key things is knowledge and how we use knowledge for all of our goods, not just for a select group of people. And thanks very much. I thought the presentations were excellent.
Maybe if
I
we
think Lucy's here.
Oh, great. Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Maybe we can have you speak for a bit once we finish answering this question. But maybe if Gargi, you could answer the first part of the question, which was, what is decolonize?
Okay, yes, okay. I'm not sure I'd do it well, but I think, and I don't want to take up loads of time because Lucy's arrived now and people come to see her, but I think, or certainly when I teach, that when I'm trying to teach students about what a global coloniality is, it's about the ways in which all spaces, including former colonizing spaces, are held together in a network of power and inequality and violence because of that lens of coloniality, which kind of has made the globe. So I know I wouldn't say, yeah, whether Ireland is a post-colonial nation or not, and I think if it is, it's only just, and don't think England's accepted that. It kind of doesn't matter, because the lens that we're trying to understand is not this space alone, but these connections, and that might be helpful right now in Britain, when Britain has done this bizarre thing which has absolutely changed what's going on the island of Ireland. And that's all about, you know, the bit that is properly occupied and the bit that Britain still thinks it's occupying are all kind of messed up economically because of Brexit, which is not an Irish decision at all. So that's kind of an example of the exercise of coloniality. I was just going to say one other thing about democratizing philosophy. I absolutely think that's a lovely thing to do, and we should remember that there are many democratizing traditions and traditions of working class organization which have always said that, and that across the world. But I'm not sure that when I think of decolonizing philosophy, I'm thinking that, oh, everyone can read Hegel. Everyone can read Hegel if they want anyway. I'm thinking more about how you would extract a liberatory knowledge from a practice of thinking that's become institutionalized. And I think that goes across disciplines, which is why I did perk up when I thought sociology small s. You're right, sociology small s doesn't work the same way as philosophy. It's not the same kind of word. But I've been playing in my head with an idea of like citizen social science. So it's like knowledge from below, and a knowledge from below, which is not only to have access to the elite knowledge, which we should all have access to anyway if we want it, but also to find a way of speaking together for a knowledge for change. And I think that's an additional step.
Nelson, do you have anything to add on the democratizing philosophy side of the question?
Well, actually, let me, I put on the chat a couple of references to Agustina Montes' work that explores the connections between the island of Puerto Rico, where Angel and myself come from, where Angel is right now, and Ireland. The Irish relationship with the United Kingdom and Puerto Rico's relationship with the US. Kind of a number of parallels in the forms of coloniality that take place in the different contexts. And sometimes you have very colonial relations even within a so-called nation state, right, depending from another. And sometimes, like in the case of Puerto Rico, not even being a nation state by itself, sovereign nation state by itself. So in this, in Agustina Montes's work, one of the titles of a book in progress is about Ireland, Puerto Rico, and the coloniality of power. And coloniality of power is a very specific way of approaching colonialism, related particularly targeting modern colonialism, going global and creating structures and ideologies that can survive the end of formal relations of colonization, right? Not that they have ended, all of them. Of course, Puerto Rico is a case. Native territories across the globe are also another case of continued colonization. But beyond that, also, there are multiple forms of coloniality. And so coloniality of power means to highlight that nexus between modernity as a civilization project and colonial relations of power. Both of them are imbricated, so that when we call for decolonization, it can never mean solely the achievement. It cannot be simply achievement of independence. It has to be a radical transformation, an overcoming of Western modernity itself, I would say. So that points to the other question. Then democratization of philosophy, I feel more comfortable with the notion of this decolonization of philosophy because partly of, as Gargi was saying, it's not a question of democratize what it already exists, but radically transform, change, and in that process, it gets to become something else in the hands of so many who are trying to radically transform the world.
Great, thank you so much. Lucy, I don't know if you've prepared something or just want to do some introductory statements, but you have.
Well, firstly, I want to apologize for having had a scheduling clash due to my inability to understand time zones. But also, I don't want to be sort of coming in so late in the conversation and possibly just repeating things and not knowing what you've talked about. So I thought maybe I would just say one thing which I think is important in the context of decolonizing philosophy. Maybe you've already talked about it, and you can let me know, and then we can maybe discuss it. Which is just that I think that we often think of, to the extent that we think about colonialism involving European powers imposing their thoughts and ways of life and ways of being and on other peoples, we think of decolonizing as maybe replacing or overcoming or getting rid of those ways of thought. But there's another way in which, there's another part of colonialism, which is, colonialism of course involves claiming something which isn't yours. And so we can think of what we think of as the Western tradition of thought. We could think, well, if we want to reject colonialism, we need to reject this tradition of thought or overcome it or replace it or supplement it or whatever. But I also think we need to question the entitlement of Europe to have claimed most of these ideas and the sense in which this tradition belongs to the so-called West and what the West even means, and what Europe, the extent to which these ideas belong to Europe. So I was just reading a paper recently in African philosophy where somebody was talking about human rights as Western ideas. And now it is, of course, part of the self-conception of so-called Western liberal democracies that human rights are a part of their culture. But if we think about how recently universal human rights featured at all in Europe and, for example, the United States, where the letting go of colonial power in Africa only began in the middle of the 20th century. Think about when anything like human rights started being recognized in the United States, when these countries started getting rid of gender and racial discrimination, it just seems wildly implausible to attribute support for belief in human rights to European and North American countries until incredibly recently. And the point at which they became ideas in those countries, they were being discussed globally. And, you know, human rights really started being talked about as an international project in response to European atrocities. So I think it's really important that we also question ideas which are taken to be Western or European ideas as to what right they have to claim those ideas. And I think this is true of, you know, what we call the Western philosophical tradition includes masses of things from the Islamic tradition, from the ancient world, which is in no way obviously Western, and ideas which and then ideas like human rights, which European and other countries thought of as Western, have really only started paying much attention to very recently. So I just want to throw into the mix that maybe this has already been discussed, the idea of also questioning what the entitlement of the so-called West or of European countries to claim that we even think of those ideas as, many of the ideas that we think of as European or Western, that we even think of them in that way. I think questioning that as part of decolonizing philosophy.
For sure, thank you so much. Maybe we'll have another question for the chat, and whoever wants to answer it can go for it. How does decolonization work to improve the lives of the direct victims of colonialism in the global South and prevent their continued oppression, e.g. through bearing the brunt of climate change, continuous economic gatekeeping and oppression? Gargi, you were saying about the occupation of Palestine currently. Maybe it'd be interesting to have that dynamic.
Sorry, I was secretly eating a cough sweet, so I wasn't coming forward. Start, you know, it feels ridiculous, doesn't it, to be in any university setting anywhere and say, we're talking about decolonisation and the stun grenades are being chucked into the prayer room, and you kind of feel like, what am I doing? But I think everyone who has spoken today, you know, both in the audience and on the platform, is not a difference. That's one of the things about Zoom, isn't it? It's no difference between the platform and the audience. That's lovely, I think. That's decolonial. Mix all the pieces up. Is that although these are practices of knowledge, they're only meaningful practices of knowledge if they're practices of liberation, and they're only meaningful practices of liberation if they're practices of liberation for all of us. So in different ways, I think people in the room have tried to talk about how we might become connected with each other, the point that Nelson has made more than once about recognizing our intertwined debts to each other and repairing those as part of a politics of love, which I think is, you know, what would be a global politics of liberation right now, apart from ways of learning and knowing the world and each other, which allow us to love others as ourselves. That doesn't give us a roadmap or a blueprint, but it does say that if there's anything to learn in the world, it must start from thinking that the question of, which someone else has said, I think the person from Dublin said, of how do we live together, is this question. It's not even how we live together, it's how some of us even get to live, isn't it? And that's a quite significant and serious redirection of institutionalized learning across much of humanity at the moment. To say, no, that is the question. Now, that doesn't mean we know the answer, but it's to say, well, look, our abilities to know things together must be directed to these questions of justice, survival, of mutuality. I'm just sound like Hallmark, but I don't know what else to say apart from that.
I can add quickly one thing, I to highlight the point that Professor Allais, said. I mean, I mentioned before how for decolonizing philosophy, one has to kind of attempt to, or that includes a reappropriation of what has been taken up by the discipline and made into a body of work, right? Quite Eurocentric and dominant, but that can, a lot of that material can be, let's say, liberated, put into the flow of other ideas, connecting with other ideas, serving a different kind of scope of idea about teaching, pedagogy, style thinking. Now, having said that, what makes that sometimes difficult is that some of the very authors in that tradition themselves built their ideas on presupposing racial divisions of humankind and the superiority of one part of superiority of some people over others. So that is that taking up and liberation of that, let's say, canon has to go through a very active process of critical examination, right? And then that includes critical tools from that canon, but also go beyond that. And in that process also engage with organizers and communities that have contributed with critical tools to do this critical examination, right? So the critical tools that we need to liberate the canon are partly in the canon, but also partly outside. And the question is, how do we build units within the university, but also outside the university that can train students to live kind of, learn from that ethos and form of conceptualizing and conceiving, producing knowledge.
Lucy, do you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I really like what was just said. I really like the idea that of liberating the canon, and I'm working a bit on, I really like Charles Mills's work on what he calls occupying liberalism. And part of what I think, so he spends a lot of time, so Charles Mills has this book on racial liberalism, where he's critiquing the history of liberalism for its complicity and hypocrisies in relation to white supremacy. But he doesn't conclude from that the basic ideas of liberalism need to be rejected. But he does think that we shouldn't assume that the tradition that has handed them down to us has understood them. So we shouldn't just notice some racism, sexism, homophobia, other exclusions in the proponents of the canon and say, okay, well, now we've noticed it, but now we can just, well, we can take this idea of individual freedom or whatever it is we're looking at in liberalism and assume that it's already been fully understood. Rather, we need to really rethink these ideas and rethink what is taken to follow from them. And I think his project of occupying liberalism as a way of saying, so the word liberal, it's a fascinating word, liberal. I spent part of my time teaching in America, where liberal means, to very many people, it means radically left-wing, maybe communist. In South Africa, it means radically right-wing, not radically right-wing, but quite right-wing, and a little bit objectionable. So left critics of liberalism think that it's concerned only with negative freedom. It has no interest in material conditions. And I think it's true that a lot of the tradition has assumed that, but is that what really follows from starting with individual freedom? I think, it's really questionable that it is. So I really think that this idea of firstly questioning whether one should accept that these ideas in any sense are European or Western, but secondly, questioning whether how they've been understood. So I liked Nelson's way of putting it, of liberating the canon as well as decolonizing the canon.
Great, thanks. I think there's a hand in the audience. Is it Phil? Do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. Put the hand down. I've been, oops, can you not see that? I don't know what's got on the camera. I've been reading in and around ideologies, intersectionality and decolonisation in education. And I was reading a Sharon Moria, and she writes about Western's intolerance to paradox. And I was just wondering if there's examples of like non-Western philosophy that encapsulates plurality, which Western philosophy lacks. I know that's a Nelson kind of question. I don't know other people's backgrounds.
I'm a little bit resistant to the idea that we could, that Western philosophy is so-called Western philosophy. I don't like the term Western philosophy because I don't think there's such a thing. But I'm a little bit resistant to the idea that it's sufficiently homogenous to say that there's something and I think that's probably also true of other traditions. I mean, I know less about, for example, the Indian and Chinese traditions, but I think you would find the materials you're looking for there. But I do want us to caution against homogenizing any of these traditions, including the so-called Western one.
I myself, I think departed from, when thinking about decolonizing philosophy or thinking about, in a way, different traditions. I wonder, the extent to which the very notion of traditions may be one of these inventions that serves particular purposes that we have to analyze critically before investing or reinvesting on it. So I think that in line with what I said before, looking at paying attention to acknowledging the debts that we have with each other, as the framework document pointed out, that calls for different lines of affiliation beyond what can be put together as a canon or a tradition, right? That sometimes then it leads to the question, my canon, my tradition, your tradition. And I think decolonization, at least as I said, is more about a kind of ongoing movement of affiliation and re-affiliation. And so ideas are not, and bodies of work are not aligned in that way. In that sense, I think that in the process of decolonization, that's what I meant before, more like the process of if one is going to liberate a canon, but of course, then the center is not the canon or the liberation. That is only relevant as part of this larger scope of looking for new forms of affiliation and forms of emancipation in the world. And so in that sense, I look more for how certain movements, how they are engaging knowledge and mobilizing it. Charles Mills is respect him greatly and is consider him a friend and a colleague. I quite don't agree with the notion of occupying liberalism, although I highlight some of the recognize some of the intelligent conceptual moves. But I'm mentioning it because in the movements that are organizing in New York City, for example, I mentioned the Strike MoMA campaign. There is and some of these movements have their roots back to occupying Wall Street. And they recognize the kind of coloniality embedded in the concept of occupation. And so they intentionally mobilize the category of deoccupying, right? Deoccupation, when they come together. The occupations as a form of decolonization, along with the idea of creating new communities built on forms of solidarity that start with acknowledging the debts that they have to each other. So I think that there are many clues out there in this actual decolonial insurgent activity that can give clues for all of those in the academy to radically transgress and innovate, our classrooms and curricula, and try to make it more connected to the struggles that are happening on the ground.
That's great, thank you. We're coming up to the end of time, so maybe we'll do one more question from the chat, and maybe we can incorporate into this like the closing remarks if you have any. So the question from Tiffany. So how do you hold dialogue that both acknowledges the power differentials while not reinforcing existing racial or other categorizations?
Very carefully.
Any other comments? Gargi, do you have any thoughts?
I keep saying, like, it's what Nelson said, but Nelson did talk about this, that a philosophy small p that is part of a larger decolonial emancipatory project must be seen as not a kind of canon of knowledge to be exchanged between any people, but a practice of becoming together. So that working out of that power differential, that's the philosophical practice, isn't it? It's a thing that you do together. It's a political and philosophical practice. I also kind of think, this is just my mummy head, we kind of need to think, well, we might all make mistakes, that the longing for freedom doesn't mean you might not mess up and offend people and hurt people, but the developing of a knowledge that could free us all should also start to give us resources to be able to say, oh, I did mess up. I did this to you. I'll try not to do it to you tomorrow. You could tell me. We could try something else. And that, I think that's probably all part of philosophy small p, isn't it? That's innovation.
Great. If no one else has something to say on the question, maybe we can just have concluding remarks. Nelson, maybe if you go first.
Well, thank you for the kind invitation again and the conversation. I really wish you the best in what you are doing. As I said, I cannot stress enough how important a student-led movement is. And, do not take it for granted. This is very special, very important. Please do continue. And as I said before, that there are other movements that you are aware of, others that maybe you're not aware of, and that deserves also study because they have come up with some questions and challenges like you have. And in the US, for example, I think the most the colonial spaces in the academy came out of a student movement mobilization, just like that. And they still they are the main defenders up to this day. So, so reach out if, for anything else. I'd be happy to work with you, connect you with other groups, and work with you. Thank you so much, and congratulations for what you're doing.
Great, thanks so much. I definitely will reach out. Lucy, if you want to go next.
Well, I feel a bit bad to have any closing remarks on a discussion that I've mostly missed. So I would like to just echo what Nelson said about the importance of what you're doing here, and it's really great that you're doing it. And the areas of this, the topics that I've particularly worked on are things in some areas in the history of philosophy, like looking at Kant's racism, looking at the question of what is Western philosophy, and looking at the question of occupying some parts of Kant's tradition. So if anybody wants to reach out to me with any questions about that part, those parts of this conversation, I'd be very happy to, but I don't sort of want to make any summarizing claims, having unfortunately missed the discussion. But thanks for the invitation and congratulations on everything you're doing here.
Thank you. Gargi, do you want to go next?
Right. Well, we've all, old people congratulate young people, and young people are still young and bouncy, and you don't understand how important it is what we're saying. What all of the grown-ups, and I know you're grown-ups too, but the older grown-ups in the room are saying is, don't underestimate what an astonishing achievement it is that you ran this thing and you've done this thing. And that's kind of partly what I mean about taking ourselves both more and less seriously. The work you're doing, even every step by step, is world-changing work. And I wonder if partly you're able to do it because you're early in your thinking career, get beaten down by institutions. I'm hopeful, but not as hopeful as I was when I was 18, frankly. But I guess the other part is about not taking yourself too seriously. And I mean being kind to yourself, that the kind of journey you're on is a bit brutal, not always, but sometimes. And that sometimes things don't go quite as you wish they will. That's okay. Get up tomorrow and start again. You're still on that journey. I just, feel very pleased and honoured to have been invited. I know I'm a bit of a kind of, must have someone who's not a philosopher. But I'm so happy to have come. And it's really been a pleasure and an honour. And thank you to everyone in the room as well. I know we didn't see all your faces, but it still feels like the work goes places, doesn't it, when more of us care about what could be achieved. More becomes possible. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. Thanks for coming, and it's been a really good conversation. Yeah, the project is still ongoing, but your kind words mean a lot. As Gargi mentioned, there is a protest on the 11th, tomorrow, if anyone wants to go to that in London, for Palestine. So yeah, I just want to highlight that as well. And yeah, thanks again to all the speakers. Sorry that Achille and Mbembe couldn't make it. His flight was cancelled, I guess, or delayed. So I'll try reach out to him and see if I can do an interview or something that I can share. But thanks so much for everyone who came, and have a good week.
Thank you.